Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the SBTI Ambition Update webinar. We will be starting shortly. Thanks for being here. Good morning and good afternoon to everyone who just joined. I see attendees are coming in. We will be kicking off the SBTI Ambition Update webinar in a minute or so. Okay, I see we have quite a few attendees already. So without further ado, I would like to start. Good morning, good afternoon. Thank you for joining us today for this webinar hosted by the Science Based Targets Initiative, or SBTI for short. And we will outline the upcoming changes to the SBTI criteria and implications for companies in today's session. My name is Anna Krüb. I'm the Manager for Environment and Climate at the UN Global Compact and part of the SBTI's corporate engagement team. I will be moderating today's session. Before we get started, just a few housekeeping announcements. This webinar will be recorded and the recording will be shared with all of you. If you have any questions to the presenters, please submit them using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. And our team will be answering those questions in writing throughout the webinar. And we will also directly address select questions during the last 15 minutes of the session. And lastly, we encourage you to use the speaker view function throughout the webinar to see the slides and the speaker. So I would like to introduce to you today's speakers. You will hear from Alberto Carrillo Pineda, the Managing Director and Co-founder of the Science Based Targets Initiative, SDP, as well as from Paola Delgado, the Head of Engagement and Corporate Engagement Manager at WWF. And as mentioned, I will be moderating today's session. We will start off with an introduction to the SBTI, setting the scene for today's webinar by Alberto. He will then continue to explain the rationale behind the SBTI's decision to ratchet up ambition to 1.5 degrees. Paola will then delve into the key changes to the SBTI criteria, which will come into force in July 2022. And she will outline the implications of these changes for companies which are already part of the SBTI. And looking ahead, Paola will then walk you through the key SBTI milestones for the remainder of 2021. Finally, I will lead us into a live Q&A session. And as mentioned, if you have questions to the presenters, please submit them using the Q&A function on your Zoom window, and indicate also if you wish to which speaker the question is directed to. Our colleagues will be answering questions in writing throughout the next hour, and then we will address a few select questions live. So without further ado, I'm handing over to the SBTI's Managing Director, Alberto Carrillo Pineda, who will provide a brief introduction to the Science Based Targets Initiative and explain why we are raising ambition. Alberto, over to you.
Great, thanks a lot, Anna, and thanks everyone for joining us today. And yeah, we're very excited to have this discussion today and to share the latest thinking on where the SBTI is heading, and also some of the rationale that is informing our strategy for the next 5 years. For those of you who are not very familiar with the Science Based Targets Initiative, the initiative is a collaboration between originally CDP, UN Global Compact, the World Resources Institute, and WWF. And we've been working with the Women Business Coalition and a wide range of partners that are helping amplify and drive the adoption of climate targets that are based on science. Our goal is really to drive the adoption of ambitious climate action in the corporate sector through the adoption and implementation of science-based climate targets. And next slide, please. Today we have over 1,700 companies that are already in this journey of science-based decarbonization. We have about half of these companies that have already set their targets and that are already in the process of implementing their targets, and about half of the companies that are in the process of getting their targets in place. Companies have 24 months to go through this process. And we also have over 700 companies that have committed to align ambition to 1.5 degrees. And that gives us, of course, great confidence to go through this transition. If you go to the next slide, please. At the beginning of this year, we released our 2020 progress report. And in this progress report, we looked at how emissions have changed for companies that have set science-based targets. And what we found is that in this time frame of 2015 to 2020 that we assessed, emissions in general, companies in general, or in average, reduced emissions by 25%, while at the same time, global emissions increased by 3.4%. And when you look at Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions, what we found out is that companies are actually reducing already emissions at a rate that exceeds the rate of reduction that is needed to 1.5 degrees. So we're seeing that companies are actually really embracing ambition and translating this ambition into action. And of course, what we need now is to scale up the number of companies setting science-based targets to really have an impact on the global shape of emissions. If you go to the next slide, please. Now, let me tell you a little bit more about the rationale to go through this ratchet-up process that we are going through right now. When the SBTI was set up in 2014, the IPCC had just released the fifth assessment report. And the fifth assessment report basically had the focus of the impacts and also the action needed to limit warming to 2 degrees. And so with that in mind, when the SBTI was set up with the idea of driving targets that were consistent with limiting warming to 2 degrees. Then in 2015, the Paris Agreement was adopted. The Paris Agreement already included language around well below 2 degrees and 1.5 degrees. As I'm sure most of you know, in 2018, the IPCC released a special report on 1.5 degrees. This report was released as a request from the Conference of the Parties of the UNFCCC. When the Paris Agreement was adopted, they asked the IPCC to explore the impacts of going above 1.5 degrees and also the transformation that was needed to limit warming to 1.5 degrees. And this report was released at the end of 2018. And the report brought great clarity. I think it was a game-changing report about the fact that we need to go through a rapid decarbonization of the economy this decade and to reach net zero emissions by 2050 in order to avoid the worst impacts of climate change. The report also brought clarity on the significant risks that we embrace if we exceed 1.5 degrees of global warming. And since the report was released, we've seen a shift in the landscape and putting much more emphasis around net zero by 2050 and 1.5 degrees. In the SBTI itself, we saw this transition. After the report was launched, we started a campaign called Business Ambition for 1.5 degrees. When the campaign was launched, we had 28 companies that joined this initial group of companies committed to align to 1.5 degrees. And today we have over 700 companies that are in this process, as already mentioned. And what we continue to hear from science, and now that we are in the middle of the finalization and publication of the sixth assessment report, what we hear from science is that the case for limiting warming to 1.5 degrees is more urgent than ever, that the risks are already being felt today. And yeah, this is really a clear signal to really address climate with the urgency that is needed. If you go to the next slide, please. And I would say we have, from the scientific perspective, the clear signal that we need to act with urgency. And on the other hand, I would say we have very positive signal coming from the companies that are going through the target setting process in the SBTI. In the past 12 months, over 2/3 of the targets that we have validated have been already in line with 1.5 degrees. 1.5 degrees has become the most common ambition in the SBTI. And we have now hundreds of companies that have committed to reach net zero emissions by 2050 through business ambition for 1.5 degrees. And many of these companies are the ones that are already setting 1.5 degree aligned science-based targets. If you go to the next slide. And so, considering these factors, the changes in the landscape, the urgency that we are getting from climate science, and the confidence that we have from how companies have embraced climate ambition, we decided to continue with the ratchet up process that we started when the IPCC was released and when we raised actually ambition from 2 degrees to well below 2 degrees. And so now we are taking the next step and raising ambition from well below 2 degrees to 1.5 degrees. We announced this as part of our new strategy that was released and communicated publicly on the 15th of July of 2021. The idea is that we are going to phase out validation of new targets that are well below 2 degree aligned in 1 year from now on the 15th of July of 2022. And after that, the idea is to only validate 1.5 degree aligned targets. And of course, our invitation to all companies is to already consider setting 1.5 degree aligned targets, because that is really what our planet needs. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Alberto, for this overview. I will now hand over to Paola Delgado for the criteria changes and implications for SBTI companies. Paola, over to you.
Thanks so much, Anna. Sorry, I was just setting up the presentation. Can you see my slides now? Can you confirm?
Yes, all good.
All good, perfect. Okay, great. So as Anna mentioned, I will now delve into the SBTI criteria changes. But before we get started, I just want to make sure that we understand what is today's focus. Actually, today we are going to talk about near-term science-based targets criteria. So this is the criteria that companies have been using to set science-based targets to date. So the targets that are being set 5 to 15 years into the future. These are the normal SBTs. However, we are now talking about near-term science-based targets because these science-based targets are connected to the long-term science-based targets that some companies are already committing to. So these companies are committing to also reach deep decarbonization throughout their value chains that is in line with 1.5 scenarios. So in a way, these science-based targets that companies are already setting, these near-term science-based targets, are the interim steps that put a company into the path or on the path to achieving these deep decarbonization or this ambition in the long term. So when we are going to talk in the coming slides about the changes to the criteria for near-term science-based targets. And as Alberto was already explaining, companies can already commit to setting these long-term science-based targets or net zero targets through our business ambition for 1.5 degrees campaign. And the initiative also commenced this process to develop a net zero standard to enable companies to set robust and credible net zero targets. The standard will include net zero validation criteria so that companies can have their net zero targets validated by the initiative. We're also developing guidance, user-friendly guidance to facilitate this process to companies, and also a set of tools to help companies calculate these long-term science-based targets as well. If you want to learn more about the net zero criteria and guidance, we have a draft on our website. I invite you to visit our website. We also have a couple of tutorials just in our YouTube channel about that. But just as a reminder, today's focus is the changes in the criteria for near-term science-based targets. Okay, so the SBTI will release the version 5 of the criteria in late 2021 for near-term science-based targets. We're currently at criteria version 4.2. And these criteria that will be released late this year will only come into force from July 15 onwards. So what will happen is that we will have between January and July 2022, two versions of the criteria coexisting. Here on this slide, you will be able to see actually what are the most relevant changes to the criteria. However, it's important to mention that the team is currently evaluating all the criteria and guidance, and the version 5 of the criteria that will be released later this year might have other changes, might include other smaller changes and clarifications as part of the normal annual review that we do. But this basically what you can see on the screen are the headlines, are the major changes. So first of all, as Alberto was explaining, we are increasing the level of ambition of scope 1 and 2 targets from well below 2 degrees to 1.5 degrees, according to what the science is telling us is needed, and the idea is to phase out well below 2 degree target validation. Then also we are increasing the level of ambition for scope 3 targets. Currently, the level of ambition, the minimum level of ambition for scope 3 targets is 2 degrees. And now this will be increased to well below 2 degrees. This is also important because for many companies, their largest source of emissions is in their value chains, and hence the greatest mitigation potential. And then finally, as well, the time frame for targets will be reduced to maximum 10 years. So currently, we're also able to accept targets that run 15 years into the future, but now in criteria version 5, this is shortened to 10 years maximum. This is important to increase accountability for short-term action and for emissions cuts, because we need to halve emissions by 2030, according to what science tells us. So these are the three major changes to the criteria. And now in the coming slides, we will talk about the implications for companies that are already approved or have already an approved target by the initiative. So first of all, we already have a criterion about this that came into force in 2019, and the criterion reads as follows. To ensure consistency with the most recent climate science and best practices, targets must be reviewed and, if necessary, recalculated and revalidated at a minimum every 5 years. So what this means is that for companies that had targets approved in 2020 or earlier, will have to update their targets, and they have until 2025 to do this. I mean, that's the deadline. However, we do encourage companies to upgrade their targets or update their targets to the latest criteria sooner than that. Actually, already many companies have done so. And then companies that were approved in 2020 will need to review and update the targets at least every 5 years. And this is 5 years from the date that it was originally approved by the SBTI. Okay. So again, as a recap, we currently are using version 4.2 of the criteria, which will continue to be valid until the 14th of July of 2022. And then criteria version 5 will be released in January or at the end of this year or at the latest early January next year. And once it is released, companies can already start using it. However, it will come into force on the 15th of July 2022. And again, as a summary, the minimum ambition for scope 1 and 2 targets is increased from well below 2 degrees to 1.5. In terms of scope 3 ambition, this is also increased from 2 degrees to well below 2 degrees. The time frame of targets for both scope 1 and 2 and also for scope 3 is shortened to 10 years maximum. And regarding the target boundary, that stays the same for near-term science-based targets. So the boundary for scope 1 and 2 targets is 95%. And for scope 3 targets, companies must cover at the minimum 2/3 of scope 3 emissions, or 67%, when scope 3 emissions are larger than 40% of the total carbon footprint. And again, the SBTI encourages companies to align with the highest level of ambition as quickly as possible. Okay, now let's talk about this campaign that also Alberto mentioned. We launched the Business Ambition for 1.5 Degrees campaign in June 2019. This campaign is run by the SBTI and partners. And basically, it is a call to action from UN global agencies and from a number of industry leaders and other organizations to for companies to set science-based targets in line with the 1.5 goal of the Paris Agreement. So basically this campaign was launched to create momentum behind the 1.5 goal in the corporate sector. And as Alberto mentioned as well, we started with 28 companies in the campaign, and currently we have more than 700 companies in the campaign, representing around $13 trillion of market capitalization. So for companies that would like to join the campaign, they have to sign this Business Ambition Commitment Letter. And I will walk you through the two options that companies have. The first one is that the company can commit to set a near-term science-based target in line with 1.5 across all relevant scopes. So what this means is that you have to align your ambition with 1.5 degrees for scope 1 and 2. And if your scope 3 emissions are larger than 40%, also you have to set a scope 3 target that is as well aligned with 1.5. Some companies have targets that are already aligned with 1.5 for scope 1 and 2. And when they sign to this option, what they just need to do is to adjust their scope 3 target or targets to be in line with the 1.5 emission scenarios. And then we have option number 2, where companies can commit to setting a long-term science-based target to reach net zero value chain emissions by no later than 2050, and as well set interim targets or near-term science-based targets across all relevant scopes in line with the SBTI criteria. And as I mentioned as well before, it's very important that companies that are setting long-term targets, they back up their strategies with setting these near-term science-based targets. Now that's the condition here in option 2. And companies can also tick both options. And when companies do that, they are committing to the highest level of ambition in the short and the long term. Quick reminder for companies that are already joined the campaign, these are the deadlines to have near-term science-based targets validated by the initiative. So for those companies that joined the SBTI via the campaign, they have the standard 24 months that all companies in the initiative have to have their near-term science-based targets approved, aligned with the option that you selected in the commitment letter. For companies that already were committed to the SBTI and later on joined the campaign, well, they have until the end of their existing commitment period to the SBTI, and if necessary, they could request a 12 months extension. And again, the targets have to be aligned to either of the options or both options that the company selected. And finally, if the company already had an approved target and later on joined the campaign, the company has 12 months from the date that they signed the campaign letter to adjust their targets if necessary to the option selected. Quick note here about our protocols. When companies do not set science-based targets within the given time frame, the commitment is removed from our Companies Taking Action webpage. So here just I encourage companies in the campaign to check their deadlines and to regularize as soon as possible, as we will be also showcasing companies in the campaign at COP26. If you have any questions actually about your alignment of the alignment of your targets to the option you selected or the deadlines to submit targets, please also contact us. Okay, so now I will go through the 3 options in the campaign and what are the implications of the updates in the criteria. So for companies that selected option 1, so 1.5 targets across all scopes, there are actually no major implications. Why? Because these companies are already committing to the highest level of ambition for their near-term science-based targets, which is 1.5. If those targets are not yet aligned, well, the company has to make those adjustments to comply with their campaign commitment. Okay, so I will now move to the option 2. Companies that committed to set interim science-based targets in line with the SBTI criteria and as well net zero targets. We'll first talk about the near-term science-based targets. If the company already has an approved target by the initiative, and this was approved before 2020 or in 2020, well, they have until 2025 at the latest to update their targets to the latest criteria, as I mentioned before. If the company was approved in 2021, they have the 5 years review period to align to the latest criteria. So that's the case when the company already has approved targets. And if the company doesn't have yet approved targets, well, they have until the 14th of July 2022 to submit targets in line with the current criteria, version 4.2, or they can also choose to submit targets in line with version 5 of the criteria when it becomes available, so around the end of the year, beginning of next year. And if the company submits after the 15th of July, then the company will have to submit targets in line with version 5. And because these companies are also committed to set long-term net zero targets, well, since the validation service for net zero targets will be open only until January 2022, after the launch of the net zero standard, companies will have that committed to option 2 in the campaign will have 24 months to have their net zero targets approved. So that will be until January 2024. And for those companies that their near-term science-based targets is not yet aligned with the 1.5 ambition, we strongly recommend you to do that, to upgrade your targets before you submit your net zero targets for validation. As you know, because if you don't have a 1.5 target yet, what will happen is that your next SBT, once you review it, will have to be more aggressive and more pronounced trajectory to catch up with the 1.5 ambition. Okay, let's go quickly through the companies that selected option 1 and 2 as well. No major implications because these companies are committing to 1.5 already across scopes for their near-term science-based targets. And then as well, they are committed to net zero and they have until January 2024 at the latest to have their net zero targets validated. Perfect. Now I'm coming to the end of my presentation. I will now talk about the upcoming SBTI 2021 milestones. And as you might be aware, early this year, we had the first public consultation on our net zero standards, specifically on the net zero criteria. We had that at the beginning of the year. Then we started developing guidance and tools that are part of the framework, of the net zero framework. And we're currently road testing this guidance and tools with a number of companies. We're about to finish that road testing, and what will come next is a second round of public consultations that will open around the 13th of September if you want to participate, and it's going to be basically a final review of the criteria, guidance, and tools for net zero target setting. The criteria, draft criteria and guidance are already available on our website if you want to check them out. So after that, we will also have, we have a comms deadline for companies that would like to join the Business Ambition for 1.5 degree campaign. So basically we are asking companies that would like to be part of the campaign to submit their commitment letter at the latest on the 30th of September, because it's basically the cutoff day that we will use to have a final list of companies that will be showcased at COP. Of course, you can also commit after that to the campaign. This is just the cutoff day to ensure that your company is showcased at COP. And we will also have a COP26 Climate Action Day on the 1st of October. That is a Friday, and it's basically a celebratory comms moment where we will invite companies in the Business Ambition campaign and also companies that already have 1.5 aligned targets we'll invite them to communicate, about their targets and their commitments, and there will be a number of options for companies to participate. We will provide you soon some instructions if you'd like to be part of it. And then also, we will have the launch of the Net Zero Standard, as I mentioned. We're aiming to have it ready by the end of October, if not possible, for sure at COP. And then we'll also have a number of events at COP26, and most likely virtual, but to be determined. We'll also showcase companies that are part of the campaign at COP through SBTI communications, as well as partners communications and the Race to Zero, because this campaign, the Business Ambition campaign, is run together with the Race to Zero. And finally, as it was the subject of today's webinar, the criteria version 5 of the initiative will be released by the end of the year, or at the latest early next year. But then from then onwards, companies will be able to use this version of the criteria. But again, it will come into force on July 15, 2022. Okay, I think that's the last slide. I will now hand it over to Anna. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Paola. Yeah, we're now at the last part of our webinar, which is the Q&A segments. And thank you to all of you who have already provided your questions in the Q&A chat box, and to the colleagues who are answering them in writing while we speak. It has been busy while we have heard from our presenters, Alberto and Paola. And before we start with the questions that were provided in the Q&A segment, we actually wanted to briefly talk about a few questions that were quite recurrent in the webinar registration form, where many of you already put forward questions you would like us to address in today's webinar. So I'm handing over to Paola for these 3 questions that we got through the registration on the sectoral decarbonization approach, biogenic carbon, as well as scope 3 requirements.
Thanks, Anna, and thank you for sending over these questions. These are very frequently asked questions, so happy to answer them now. So the first one is if the SBTI will release 1.5 aligned intensity pathways for sectors that are covered under the sectoral decarbonization approach, or SDA. And the short answer is yes. We already have an intensity pathway in line with 1.5 degrees for power generation. And yes, the SBTI team is currently developing 1.5 aligned intensity pathways for other sectors covered in the SDA. So the sectors covered in the SDA are industrial sectors such as, for example, pulp and paper, cement, iron and steel, commercial buildings, etc. And we are currently doing that. The time frame to finalize this work, some of them might come at the end of the year, some others will come at the beginning of next year. So please stay tuned, but yes, this will become available. As well, we have other sector developments, like for example, the forest, land and agriculture sector development, that will also become available, but only until next year, Q1. And we have other sector developments that you can consult on our webpage for the latest information. We also recommend you as well to have a look at our target validation protocol and also our how to guide to setting science-based targets, because there's in those documents you can find more specific criteria to certain sectors. But yeah, the SBTI is facilitating these 1.5 aligned sectors. And that's about the SDA. Just a reminder before I move to the second question is that companies actually are allowed to use the SDA, but also they can choose to use the absolute contraction method, which is also a very robust method that, you know, it's based on the average reduction rates at the global level from the IPCC. And then, sorry, just a clarification as it's popping up in my mind, but the only sectors that cannot use the absolute contraction approach right now are the companies in the oil and gas sector or with oil and gas activities in their value chain. These companies are waiting for the oil and gas sector development to be completed, as well as power generation companies. Those companies are asked to use the SDA, at least to check the minimum level of ambition, as the decarbonization pathway for power generation companies is much steeper than for other sectors. Then now on the second question, how is biogenic carbon integrated into SBTI target requirements? Well, we have criteria around biogenic carbon. Basically, companies have to report biogenic emissions alongside with their GHG inventory, and they have to include these emissions, you know, when like from bioenergy and biomass feedstocks into their target boundary. You know, these have to be included into the target boundary. However, some companies are considering these biogenic emissions carbon neutral, and that's possible, but companies have to justify this in the target submission form of why they're treating these emissions are carbon neutral. There are some developments that are coming up, like the forest, land, and agriculture, that will have more requirements and specificity around how to treat these biogenic emissions for companies in land sectors, as well as the GHG protocols is also developing more guidance for bioenergy and land use change emissions that will become available next year, and companies will be required as well to review that new guidance and to adjust their targets if it's, you know, triggered by the recalculation of GHG inventories. Finally, what are the SBTI requirements for setting Scope 3 targets? This is also a good question. We didn't have time to go over Scope 3 criteria, but I mentioned it a couple of times. The Scope 3 criteria is that if you have Scope 3 emissions larger than 40%, so if Scope 3 emission represents 30% at the minimum or more of your total carbon footprint, then you'll be asked to set Scope 3 targets. And the boundary for this Scope 3 target or Scope 3 targets has to be 2/3 of Scope 3 emissions, so 67%. There are a number of available methods for Scope 3 target setting. You can use one of them, a combination of them. You know, we have absolute contraction. Companies can also use the SDA to estimate certain targets for certain categories, or then they could also choose among other types of Scope 3 targets that are listed on our SBTI criteria. And it's important to mention that we are still flexible on Scope 3 criteria, because we recognize that there are a number of challenges related to Scope 3 accounting, Scope 3 emissions tracking, etc. So very important to also provide some flexibility there. We provide some flexibility in terms of the ambition, in terms of the boundary, in terms of the data quality, etc. The most important is that companies start tackling these emissions, as these are, as I mentioned, very relevant for certain sectors and certain companies. So yeah, with that, I think I covered the 3 questions, Anna. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Paola. And as mentioned, these were some of the FAQ that came up in the registration already from the webinar. And while we were presenting, many of you indicated a Q&A in our Zoom Q&A box. And one question that has come up a few times is, and I'm happy to respond to that, is on why the 1.5 aligned targets are referencing 4.2% of annual linear reduction. And the rate of decarbonization that we are referencing and that informs 1.5 degree target setting is based on the most robust scenarios assessed by the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And more details on those scenarios can be found in the paper Foundations for Science-Based Target Setting that is available on the resource page of the SBTI website, so the Foundations for Science-Based Target Setting paper. Then we have also a couple of questions around reporting of emissions. And I would like to ask you, Paola, to get back to this question from some of our attendees. How will the SBTI track progress by companies against their targets?
Yeah, thank you so much for the question. Actually, I would like to start by saying that the SBTI already started an exercise to, as Alberto was saying, to track progress of companies that have already set science-based targets. He mentioned our progress report of 2020, where we actually looked at the targets that were already approved to understand if companies were making any progress and what was the most typical rate of reduction, which was very encouraging because companies are reducing their emissions. The typical SBTI company is reducing emissions at a rate that exceeds the 1.5 ambition, so that's quite encouraging. And we will continue to do that in our next progress reports. However, we are also starting a project, or we already commenced a project to develop all the rules and infrastructure for monitoring, reporting, and verification. So that's the plan of the SBTI. We have developed this infrastructure for validating the ambition and robustness of targets, and now the plan is to develop as well these rules and infrastructure and this model to track as well progress against targets. And this is very important because we are in the decade of delivery, of course. We need to make sure that we are on track to halve emissions by 2030. And also a lot of stakeholders globally are already using the SBTI as a benchmark, for instance, financial institutions and capital markets that are checking on which companies have already set science-based targets and how are they progressing towards their targets. And then that also triggers some economic benefits for companies that are delivering on their targets. No? So I think very important work, and I will just invite the attendees here to stay tuned as we develop this MRV. There will for sure be some opportunities to provide input on the framework. So happy to share those advancements once they become available.
Thank you very much, Paola. Another question that is, of course, on top of many attendees' minds is the question on offsetting. For companies that have set net zero targets are SBTI signatories, and the question is whether the SBTI will provide more detailed requirements on what types of carbon offsets will be accepted, if any will be accepted. Great if you can share a few thoughts on that, Paula.
Sure. So we actually talk about this on our net zero guidance. So happy for you to just summarize here a couple of those points that are there already. But first of all, I just want to first recap on the elements of net zero target setting. So companies that are committed to set net zero targets are required to have robust targets, near-term targets that are in line with the 1.5 ambition. And then as well for their long-term science-based targets, these companies are committing to achieve a state of deep decarbonization, and any residual emissions, if any, will need to be neutralized with an equivalent amount of CO2 removals and permanent storage. So that's reaching net zero, right? So for this neutralization part, companies would need to then invest in solutions to capture CO2 and storage that CO2. And that could be part of, could be within the company's value chain or outside the value chain. But the most important is that the physical effect on the climate is this removal of CO2. So usually some offsets are actually neutralization strategies, but there are also some other offsets that the main objective is to reduce emissions or avoid emissions outside of the value chains. So the SBTI's recommendation is that companies can use these offsetting strategies in the path or on the path to reaching net zero. But at the point of net zero, the most important is to neutralize or to use offsets that are result in the neutralization of any residual emissions. So the SBTI is currently as well evaluating, what is the landscape of offsetting globally, and we are most likely going to provide some more guidance only next year. The net zero guidance or framework that will be released at the end of the year focuses on these net zero long-term targets for decarbonization. The tool that the team has developed will help companies to understand what are these deep decarbonization targets that they would need to set, and that will also determine the amount of residual emissions that companies will have to neutralize. So yeah, also stay tuned on that, and we invite you to as well check the net zero standard once it becomes available at COP.
Thank you so much, Paola. We also got a few questions around the Business Ambition for 1.5 campaign and the differences between option 1 and option 2. I'm happy to answer those. So the question is, what is actually now the difference between option 1, which is a commitment to 1.5 degrees across all scopes, and option 2, which is net zero and also setting interim science-based targets. And so the main difference is that with the interim science-based targets, they need to be aligned with the SBTI criteria and recommendations as of today, meaning that for the time being, they can still be aligned with well below 2 degrees, as well as for scope 3, the requirement remains well below 2 degrees. While option 1 is, as you have seen, 1.5 degrees across all scopes. And talking about scope 3, we got a couple of questions And I wanted to hand you this one, Paola, which is around the methodological challenges that many companies still face when assessing and monitoring their Scope 3 emissions, resulting in sometimes maybe more estimates than very specific numbers. And at the same time, the SBTI requires companies to set a Scope 3 target, as you have said, when those emissions are for, at least 40% of the total emissions. And so why are we, to borrow the wording of the question, insisting on Scope 3 despite those methodological challenges?
Yes, so we need to halve emissions by 2030, right? So companies, as I mentioned, so many companies have their greatest opportunities for mitigation in Scope 3. And indeed, there are many challenges regarding GHG accounting and tracking. And we take into consideration that because at the very minimum, what we're asking companies to do is to submit to the initiative GHG, Scope 3 GHG screening. So basically, this is a high-level assessment of the hotspots in a company's value chain. There are a couple of options for companies to do this. There's, for instance, the Scope 3 evaluator of quantities, where you can estimate at the very high level, of course, with a lot of uncertainty, right, in terms of the estimates for each of the categories that are applicable for your company. But that's sufficient for you to at least set science-based targets for the categories that you have the largest emissions. And we understand that actually, for you to be able to track progress against your targets, then your Scope 3 calculations will have to evolve, right? So you'll need to, of course, during the time of your or time frame of your Scope 3 targets, also implement projects to improve the quality of your estimates, perhaps as well start requesting directly emissions estimates from your suppliers, etc. So we understand it's an evolution, and only by setting already Scope 3 targets today, that's how you will trigger as well this evolution in your GHG inventory. As I said as well, we are flexible on our criteria. We understand that numbers are not perfect, and then we understand when the company still needs to work on some data gaps, etc. But the most important is to act now, to start engaging with your supply chains. For example, there will be also some upcoming guidance on supply chain action by the end of this year, and where you will be able to find in this guidance all the resources that are already available out there. And then we will also recommend as well to find some initiatives that are already working, on supply chains. For instance, TDP supply chain program, but there are many new ones that we encourage you as well, because this is a shared challenge for companies, and only by peer learning we could progress faster, right? So happy to point you to those initiatives, and yeah, just encourage you to start your journey on Scope 3 emissions accounting and target setting.
Thank you so much, Paola. And I will briefly address another question on the Business Ambition for 1.5 campaign that came in a few variations. Does submitting to the Business Ambition for 1.5 campaign sign you up for the UNFCCC Race to Zero, the coalition of businesses, investors, cities, etc., for net zero emissions in the lead up to COP26? The answer is yes. We are very closely working with the Race to Zero, and Business Ambition for 1.5 is one of the entry points to join the Race to Zero. And So we very much encourage you to join, of course, as mentioned in before COP26, and to be listed on the various list of signatories. We would require your commitment letter by 30 September. And secondly, is there a fee or a cost connected to the Race to Zero? There is no cost to the Race to Zero for companies that are joining. As you know, or as you will see in the FAQ, companies in the Business Ambition for 1.5 campaign need to set science-based targets, and the science-based target validation service has a fee that is due when companies submit their target for validation. You can find the details on these fees as well as on options to waive the fee and reductions for SMEs in our FAQ. But just to reiterate, for the Race to Zero, there is no fee for joining for companies. With a view on the time, I would like to close the Q&A segment now. Thank you very much for all your questions. And before we close the webinar, we would like to take a chance, as I just said, to invite all companies to join Business Ambition for 1.5 in the global Race to Zero ahead of COP26. You will find the commitment letter to join on the SBTI website under Business Ambition for 1.5, or also the 5-step process, and as well as guidance on how to join and what to do once you join. Of course, please also feel free to reach out to us if you have questions about the commitment. And finally, as a reminder, this webinar was recorded and the recording will be shared with all of you over email. And we thank you very much for joining the discussion. We look forward to working with you in the run-up to COP26, and we hope you join us in raising climate ambition. Thank you very much.